evening. Welcome to Hampshire College lecture series on science and religion. This is a sequel to yesterday's lecture, and today we don't have a lecture, we have an actual panel on Islam and evolution. And some of you were here yesterday also. This is part of a two-day conference which we just concluded about an hour ago on Darwin and evolution in the Muslim world. And we've been very fortunate for the last 2 days. We've had scholars from all over the world here at Hampshire College exchanging ideas about this topic. This conference, I should mention, was made possible by the sponsorship of Carnegie Corporation of New York, so we are very thankful to Carnegie Corporation. So today's panel, we have three people. I will introduce our moderator, Jason Wiles, and then Dr. Wiles is going to introduce our other panelists. Dr. Wiles grew up in Arkansas, a southern state in the heart of the American Bible Belt, the storied history of controversy around the teaching of evolution in public schools. Dr. Wiles grew up in a creationist family and earned his first degree in biology at a private religious university where evolution was largely absent from the curriculum. He went on to earn master's degrees in both biology and geosciences, both heavy on evolutionary evidence and theory. After having taught biology and other sciences at a number of colleges, universities, and institutions of secondary education for several years, he recognized that a great many students had similar misconceptions and related difficulties in learning about biology that were rooted in a misunderstanding of evolution, whether or not these barriers were based on religious belief. Given his own personal experience and given the centrality of evolution to a deep understanding of the life and earth sciences, Dr. Wiles was motivated to learn more about the teaching and learning of evolution. He eventually earned a PhD at McGill University, focusing on evolution education, and for the past 4 years has served as research manager and now as associate director of the Evolution Education Research Center. In fact, some of the results were discussed today, this morning, and they're fascinating results, and hopefully we will see them in print and we'll sometime share it at a bigger level. He joined the faculty in the biology department at Syracuse University in 2008 and enjoys a secondary appointment in the SU department of science teaching, Syracuse University, science teaching. I should also mention that this is a pretty small venue for Dr. Wiles because he will not be intimidated by you because he regularly faces 800 students twice a week, at least. And so, large class. So please welcome Dr. Jason Wiles.
Well, I appreciate that welcome. It's quite an introduction for someone who is merely going to be giving introductions. So we have two wonderful panelists here, and I will try to add what I can if questions arise. But I really, I'm very anxious to hear what our two main panelists have to say. I first saw these two together at a similar conference we did at McGill University, and the discussion that was sparked by their particular presentations was pretty much for me the highlight of the conference we had up there, and the public responded very well, variously but warmly. So I think it's going to be an interesting evening. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our first panelist. I'll tell you who he is by posing, a question, basically. One of the greatest discoveries in biology over the last decade is that all animals use the same genes to control the development of their body plan. If all animals share the same genes, then how has the diverse body plan from jellyfishes to humans evolved? That's a pretty big question. And Ehab Abouheif is an evolutionary developmental biologist who has tried to answer this fundamental question by using ants as a model system in his lab for almost 15 years. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at McGill University. And he is also the first Canada Research Chair in Evolutionary Developmental Biology in Canada. and in 2006 became an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow for his interdisciplinary approach to evolutionary and developmental biology. So I'm very interested to hear what you have to say, Ehab. Please welcome Dr. Abouheif.
Thank you. It's quite an honor, and I'd like to thank Jason for the introduction, of course, and I'd like to thank Salman and the support staff for making this a truly wonderful event. It's everything that I'd hoped to get out of it, both intellectually and very stimulating discussions. Well, as you know, religion, and especially Islam, is both an individual and a collective enterprise. And most of our discussions have been focused around Islam as a collective enterprise, and how can we understand its connections between science, especially the science of evolution, and society. Well, what I think this is a slightly different approach that we'll be taking here, in the sense that I'll be giving a very personal sort of narrative of both Islam and evolution. And that's because I am continually faced with the challenge of being Muslim and being an evolutionary biologist at the same time. And hence the title here, Abouheif being my last name, and of course this and/or, which I hope to address. If you've read Strunk and White during your college years, you'll know that William Strunk Jr. hated this sort of and/or kind of in sentences, and so hopefully we'll be able to resolve it for him during the course of this discussion. Okay. It's also quite an honor to. I don't usually start talks like this, but it's on the rare occasion that I can say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which means in the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. And this is the phrase that Muslims use pretty much when they start anything. If you're about to drink a glass of water, you would say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. If you're about to drive your car, and you can just imagine any particular situation you'd like. So it's quite an honor to be able to start with this. And it goes back to basically my youth. At a very early age, I was sort of born into Islam, and my parents tried to teach me how to pray from an early age. And it was, how we grow up in life has a truly marked effect on how we think in the future. So, during my first years, of course, I was taught the 5 pillars of Islam. Which are, of course, the Shahada, which is you just have to say that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad his Prophet. You must pray 5 times a day. You must fast the holy month of Ramadan. You must pay zakat, or give charity, typically around 2% of your annual salary. And you must do the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. So these are the 5 pillars of Islam in which my parents have taught me. I can't say that I follow each of them to the T, but of course one tries. Okay. So then we start getting to the issue, of course, of how is it that one can be a Muslim and an evolutionary biologist at the same time. And this is of course the challenge. So one starts with a very basic presumption, of course, that there is no experiment in science which can test the existence of a deity or Allah. I mean, there's no possible experiment that we can do that will tell us or prove or disprove the existence of Allah or a deity. And so that renders, a number of positions that a scientist can assume. And if you look at some of our most popular public intellectuals, that would be Richard Dawkins, who have spoken to the subject, Richard Dawkins, Ken Miller, Stephen Jay Gould, each who have written books about the subject. You will note that they've each taken different types of positions. Richard Dawkins is a staunch non-believer. Ken Miller poses himself on the opposite side as a believer, and of course Stephen Jay Gould, who is an atheist. And so the fact that we cannot determine the existence of a deity renders a plurality or a diversity of positions that one can assume, and of course we see this in our most renowned public intellectuals. Okay, and of course I've chosen the path of a believer, And this, I think, is the same cloak that I was wearing as a kid of course, that my parents have put on me now. But I've chosen the path of a believer as a Muslim. And here, I would like to say that I'm a very sort of a moderate Muslim. You can see my aunt, who's very dear to me. Of course, she's not wearing a hijab here, but still, she embraced Islam. Okay. So how do we do that? And I'm just going to now just switch over to Abouheif now, myself as an evolutionist or an evolutionary biologist, will talk about a little bit about the science of evolution, what I face every day, how I see the evidence of evolution every day in my work, and the research that I do. And we'll see if we can come to a resolution at the end. So Abouheif is evolutionist. Anyway, this ant here is that you see. This is myself here, and this is I've got the ant Camponotus floridanus sitting on my finger here. And Camponotus floridanus, I collected this. This very ant was collected in Tallahassee, in the National Forest in Tallahassee, Florida. And you can see, obviously, myself and my graduate student here, we have to do quite a bit of digging to get these ants. We have to go down at least 6 feet. And so, obviously, these ants have taken me all over the world and have gotten me to dig tremendously. I thought that, God was sending me a sign, and that's maybe how I could basically resolve my religious and scientific sort of notions. I thought that that was the key, but it wasn't quite how we did it. It was more really the diversity I'm really struck by the diversity of ants. And here's just a small number of ants. I mean, there are actually 15,000 species of ants out there, and they all belong to a single family called the Formicidae. And here we just take a small sampling of these ants, and you can see there's a remarkable diversity. I mean, I never imagined as a kid that there might be an ant that looks like Darth Vader over here, okay? Another ant that, has little sort of hair growing on it that looks like Curly Moe. Another ant that looks like, I call this ant the bling bling ant because I think it's very sort of shiny and very attractive, okay? And, and in many different ways. I mean, you can just find every single kind of diversity, and then there's just a small capturing of the diversity that you see. So it's very humbling, actually. It's taken this diversity. I mean, once you're faced to it, and if you want to study it, you have to be willing to travel to all kinds of places. And I just want to say that. Well, I'll just go back for a second. So there's 15,000 species of ants. They're very ecologically dominant. So these 15,000 species are said or are estimated to be about 1/3 of the global biomass of insects. They're about 100 million, just far back as 135 million years ago. And in the most recent book by Bert Holdobler and E.O. Wilson, some of the foremost experts on ants have estimated that if you take the entire biomass of humans and you can somehow put them in a blob, right, and then you take the entire biomass of ants and you put them in a blob, that those blobs would be equivalent to one another. So in terms of biomass, they're incredibly dominant. But words don't really cut it. So hopefully I'll just be able to show you a little bit about their dominance. Here is the entrance of a leaf cutter. So this is, I'll just show you, go back. Here is a soldier of a leaf cutter ant, the head of a soldier of a leaf cutter ant. Looks somewhat innocent there. So here's the entrance of one of the leaf cutter ants. But of course, it's a lot bigger than it appears. But of course, this is just an entrance. Okay, and we tried to dig it up with a colleague of mine, also Walter Chinkel, who does remarkable work on ants as well. Okay, and of course, this is just an entrance. You can just easily throw a shovel inside there. And I'm just going to show you this documentary. It's a 3-minute clip. I'm going to go a little over my 20-minute designation by 3 minutes, but I think this is a worthwhile 3 minutes in your life. It comes from the documentary called Ants, Nature's Secret Power. I highly recommend it. It's hosted by Bert Holdobler, and you can get it online. Anyway, just watch this. Enjoy.
The next stage of the investigation was to find out what one of these subterranean cities looked like. The amount of cement required is extraordinary. For 3 days they kept pouring, until 10 tons of cement had disappeared down the tubes. After a month, they begin the excavation, led by Professor Louise Forci. It takes weeks to uncover the secret megalopolis of the ants. With the help of mechanical diggers, the scientists remove tons of earth. At last, they begin to see the structure of the city-state. There are subterranean highways connecting the main chambers, and off the main routes are side roads. The paths branch and lead to many fungus gardens and rubbish pits. The tunnels are designed to ensure good ventilation and provide the shortest transport routes. Everything looks like it has been designed by an architect, a single mind. But of course that isn't true. This colossal and complex city was created by the collective will of the ant colony, the superorganism. The structure covers 50 square meters and goes 8 meters into the earth. In its construction, the colony moved 40 tons of soil. Billions of antloads of soil were brought to the surface. Each load weighed 4 times as much as the worker, and in human terms was carried a kilometer to the surface. It is the equivalent of building the Great Wall of China. It is truly a wonder of the world.
Okay, so we can see that ants are quite sophisticated. Okay, and what I'm just showing you here, a picture, an aerial photograph taken by Lawrence Allen Smith. The colony you saw there was one from Costa Rica, but what you're seeing here is one in Texas, and what you see here is a leafcutter ant colony right here. And you can see that it's cleared all the forest all around the colony, just around itself. So clearly they're ecologically dominant and quite a force of nature. So what makes them so dominant? What's the reason behind their success? The first very important aspect of this is to realize that there's what's called a division of labor within an ant colony. And when a queen lays an egg, just depending on the social cues and the environment, so temperature, nutrition that egg experiences, that egg can either develop into a queen, which you see here on your left, and of course here the worker on the right. Now you might think that it's the same genes that can do the queen or the worker, but the differences between them are dramatic. The queen can live up to 30 years, and the worker just a few months. And it's the exact same genes that are just triggered by the environment which can create this difference. You've got the queen, of course, which has fully functional wings and flies to mate, while the worker has no wings at all. You've got the queen, of course, which lays millions of eggs once she lands and sheds her wings, and of course the worker, which lays very few eggs or is almost sterile. So it's this specialization of the workers, or this division of labor, of course, okay, together with the fact that they have remarkable amounts of cooperation, make ants the ecologically dominant and very diverse group that they are. Now, their cooperation is so remarkable that, in fact, companies such as FedEx and Southwest have been thought to use algorithms that are based on the cooperation in ant colonies. called the ant optimization algorithm. And they basically take inspiration from these algorithms in the colonies to try and figure out how they're going to schedule the routing schedules of their trucks to optimize, to waste either the least amount of time or the least amount of gas or whatnot. That's how, basically, how sophisticated their cooperation can be. Okay, so how did this all evolve? And that's the question. How do ants evolve? How do they get to the state that they are such that they can be, so ecologically diverse? And this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to give you some evidence that we can look at to see their evolution, their evidence of their evolution. It's so clear, I can't deny it, Even if I wanted to, I just couldn't do it, and I hope you'll feel the same. But just before I do that, I wanted to define evolution, because it's so important that we all define evolution in exactly the same way. So when we use just the word evolution as an evolutionary biologist, basically, the word evolution just means change over time. Okay? Doesn't mean anything other than that. Cars can evolve, makeup can evolve, fashion can evolve, anything, organic or non-organic, can evolve. If we just use the word evolution just meaning change over time. And this is the confusion. I mean, that's, of course, very different than when we talk about biological evolution, and we restrict ourselves now to the organic world. And when we talk about biological evolution, what we're talking about, of course, is the descent with modification of organisms from common ancestors. That's what we're talking about when we say biological evolution. Generations descend from previous generations. They're all connected by common ancestors, and each generation is slightly modified from the previous one. And it's this biological evolution that is a fact. There is nothing about, when we talk about, I know there's some confusion about theory or fact, but biological evolution is a fact. It happens. We have descent with modification from from organisms from common ancestors. But what do then we mean when we say evolutionary theory? So basically, how did this biological evolution happen? Okay? And that's where we start talking about theory. There are three major components that are also fact, the things that are underlying. There is, of course, we know that all organisms, okay, from one generation to the next display variation. That's a fact. We know, for example, that all organisms are subject to selection. That's a fact. And they're subject to other random forces like genetic drift. Where the theory comes in now, where the term theory comes in, is, okay, now, how, in what combination, which of these is most important for the evolutionary process? Okay? Some evolutionary biologists will argue, well, the variation is the most important, because without variation you can't get evolution. Some will say, no, selection is the force that will basically determine the rate and direction of evolution. Others will say, no, genetic drift is the most important. Biological evolution is a fact. The fact that variation, selection, and genetic drift occur are facts. But which of these is most important for the evolutionary process? That's a theory. And then, of course, within each category, evolutionary biologists argue. Does variation come largely from genes or the environment? Is it random, or is there some aspects of it that are non-random? Selection, is it all natural, sexual, artificial? Does it occur on the level of the individual, group, species, or higher categories, such as catastrophic events? When a meteor hits the ground, you're not selecting on individuals anymore, you're just wiping out entire groups, taxonomic groups. Genetic drift, okay? How often does that occur? Is it a potent force in evolution? So this is the thing. Biological evolution is a fact. Variation, selection, genetic drifts are facts. But which of them is most important in determining evolution? And within each of those, the random, non-random nature of the environment, variation, selection, at which level, and genetic drift, its frequency, those are the things that become theories. And different evolutionary biologists, depending on which group or organisms they work on, might have different explanations for evolution. And that's what makes it a theory. So that's important. Anyway, we can now get to the origin of the ants. And you can see here that I put this up because ants, the 15,000 species, like I said, belong to a single family of the Formicidae. And what's very striking is the two most socially, they say that basically ants, right after humans, are the most socially complex animals that are out there. When I mean socially, not individually complex in their behavior, but socially together are the most complex. And the honeybees give a good run for the money to the ants as well. But both of them are actually just derived wasps. So you can see here that from the wasps, you had some basal groups of wasps, outsprung, you can even just see here, just from this particular branch, these are all wasps here, and outsprung ants. Ants are just derived wasps. And you can see over here that bees are also just derived wasps. And both of these groups, the bees and the ants, actually play quite important roles in the Quran. There is a surah, in all of the surahs, there is a surah of the ants, Surah An-Naml. And there's also a Surah An-Nahl, the surah of the bees. And interestingly, they both belong to the same related family. They both come from the wasps. Okay? And the question is, we can actually trace this. Okay? So we know that the earliest ant ancestor, we actually have fossil evidence that goes as far back. And this is a fossil called Sphecomerma freyi. And what you would have predicted, I mean, if ants come from wasps, what might one have predicted? Well, the earliest ancestral ant, or worker ant, should have some mix of wasp and ant-like characters. And that's exactly what we found in this amber fossil of the ants. And you can see these antennae over here, and it's sort of petiole and segments, all have very wasp-like, it has a very wasp-like head. It's got a mix of ant and wasp-like characters. And so it fits quite, it sort of fits the bill as our sort of the earliest fossil. And it was just found randomly by a couple in New Jersey who were walking, picked this up and just decided to call E.O. Wilson and Frank Carpenter at Harvard. And to their surprise, it was really something. So then how do we generate all that diversity I showed you before? Well, let's just pick on one particular character. Obviously, queens and male ants, like I showed you, is a division of labor. The queens have wings. So that means they have to fly in the air to mate. So what they have in addition to just these are their two eyes over here, what they have in addition are what are called these ocelli. These three additional light-sensing organs on the top of their heads to help them navigate during the mating process so they can mate, fall to the ground. The queen then rips off her wings, you know, okay? And then she rips them off, she goes underground, starts excavating her nest. But during that flight process, they need to have these extra light-sensing organs to help them navigate. Well, the workers don't have wings and they'll never fly. So they don't really need that extra light-sensing organism, and they live most of their life under the earth. But yet you can see do you see these little remnant or traces over here of these three ocelli? You can see that there's one over here, another one over here, and another one over here. So somehow they haven't completely gotten rid of them. Well, what I decided to do, this is like a single species. This is a species of ant called Glasius alinus. It's the common garden ant. You'll find this ant it's basically spread almost everywhere in the world, and I guarantee you'll probably have this species in your garden. Okay. Anyway, well, depending on where you collect this ant, if you collect it from California, okay, I'll just show you 3 pictures. We can even go more. California, Florida, or the Netherlands. It's all the same species, just different populations in different places. But you'll still find variation. If you look at the workers, look at the 3 spots. Okay, see you have here these 3 spots are sort of appearing. They're somewhat apparent. Look at the development of the spots on this one. Okay, they're a bit more. Do you see that they're a lot more apparent? And then look at this over here. This spot, the 3 spots over here, a little more developed than the first one, but not quite as developed as this one. Yet we all put them in the. I mean, these are just slight variations in the species. All that dramatic variation you see between species starts off within a species at a very small level. And so the idea that species are fixed and don't change is non-tenable. No matter where you look, it's not just in those ocelli, but look at the colors are different. Okay? You can see even somehow in their jaw morphology, you see slight differences. Look at their eyes actually too. You can see that their eyes are slightly starting to vary and diverge too. So it's not just in those ocelli, but in other different characters. Same species, different populations of the same species. So characters start to evolve and diverge just within populations. Okay? And then we can look between species, and you can see that some species actually now have evolved to have really quite developed ocelli. There must be some function associated with it, although we don't know. you know, and some don't have it at all. Some have them, again, slightly developed. Again, nothing over here. Slightly developed, you can see them, and sort of, I can't see. Do we have any here? I think you can just barely see them.
Yeah, there's like one in the middle.
There's one in the middle, okay. So that you start off going now just one step between species, and you can see the variation. And of course now if you go between species and just focus on that trait, we come back. Here you can see now this leafcutter ant with this quite developed one. You have others that are very well developed, some that are moderately developed, some with none at all, and the diversity continues. Okay? So you start off within a species, then getting greater differences between species, and then you start getting diversity, not just in those characters, but in others. I just wanted to show you that. But again, somebody might say, well, you know, those are ocelli. Okay, they come and they float in and out between species. But what about characters that you can, really global characters, big characters? Show me something important. Wings or not wings? Well, I don't care. If you show me these through 4 species, I cannot see wings. Okay, if you look here, no matter how hard you look, you won't find a wing on this worker. Okay, which is quite differently related from this worker. There are no wings or trace or wings, no traces or wings here, no traces or wings here. So so in that sense, species haven't changed. All you guys are showing me is just microevolution, small changes between species. But what about these big characters? Well, work from my lab has shown, fine, it doesn't, just because you can't see evolution at the level of morphology, work from my lab has shown that if you look at the genes that control those wings, you'll see that the genes underlying the wings have evolved. So the way you shut off wings in this species, and that's, you see these boxes are the network of genes, so it's a bunch of genes interacting with one another. Those in green are turned on, and those in red have been shut off to shut off the wing. And so you can see the genes in this species that have been shut off are different from this one, are different from that one, and are different from this one. So what's not apparent, readily apparent at the level of morphology, if you just go one level down, you'll start to see even evolution in the way that those structures have been shut off. Okay. And that, of course, all of this must have happened from change from the ancestor as a worker without wings here. Okay, another very interesting story I want to tell you, and this is work that still in progress in my lab, so you're fortunate to see stuff that's just hot off the press. But it's about this. So now we'll focus instead of like on the whole of ants, 15,000 species. You have this remarkable genus that E.O. Wilson at Harvard spent 17 years of his life putting it together. And basically, he put this book, it's called Pheidole in the New World, a dominant hyperdiverse ant genus. The book is about this thick. And what he did is it's a taxonomic work. He discovered 300 species of his own just by going out there and collecting. And then he now had to put it together. He had to somehow organize them together with the 300 species that were already known. And he did this in his book, and he did it basically every day. He sat there and he worked for an hour at his microscope bench to put all this together. And you can see here the number of species now known in the New World, of course, is around 650 species, as compared to Camponotus, which is that was the ant on my finger. Okay, there are about 300 species in that genus, and then you can go down the scale. And so this Pheidole is what's called hyperdiverse, to have 700 species in a single genus. And the reason for that is what's depicted in this lovely drawing over here by Dan Berner, a postdoc who was a former postdoc at McGill University. He doesn't work on ants at all. He just came and gave me this lovely drawing. And this depicts a soldier. So most ants have just workers. They have a queen, a caste of queens and males, and they have a single worker caste that, they vary. But these guys have a distinct soldier caste. I'll get to what they do in a second. This is just one of the species that E.O. Wilson named in his taxonomic work. You'll see that it was named after a famous actor. Okay, here, obviously, Harrison Ford was quite interested in donating money to the project. So if you're interested in donating the world to taxonomy, you can have an ant named after you. Okay, so what do these soldiers and workers do in this colony? So they've invented a novel soldier caste, and that's what's hypothesized to be so special about these ants. And you can see, basically, in this colony, you have a winged queen again that's reproductive. 95% of the ants that you'll find in these species are the minor workers, and the minor workers do most of the tasks. They do the foraging and the rearing of the brood, and they'll feed the larvae. They do most of these kinds of nursing tasks. The soldiers, however, are only 5% of the colony, and it's about, they basically are there for defense. Okay? And so they defend the nest in a Spartan-type way. They have Spartan-like tactics. They'll fight to the death. Okay? And there's some unfortunately I don't have time to discuss some of those tactics, but we could, I could talk for hours, of course, but I'm not going to. So anyway, but they're about 5%. And what's interesting is they keep them, they have a mechanism to keep them at 5% over here and 95% over here. So if you did the experiment, this was in the early 40s, in which you remove all the workers from a colony, they know somehow that the workers have been removed, and all the next batch of eggs that the queen lays are workers. And if you do the same experiment and you remove all of the soldiers, the colony knows that you removed all the soldiers, and then they'll raise all the workers until they have like a nice balance of 5% again. It sort of overshoots, like a physiological, overshoots, undershoots, and then sort of regulates. And that regulation, in that regulation is a very interesting part. I don't have time to talk about it, but it ends up in resulting in very interesting variations. If somehow that regulation goes wrong a little bit, you can make some very interesting things. And this is just depicting, we collect these Phytoli ants in this one that I just showed you. It's called Phytoli morsi. We collected in the pine barrens of Long Island. And you see here, myself and my colleague here, Ray Sandwald, are digging up these ants. And there are close to, there are thousands, 10 to 20,000 ants in these particular colonies. They're small little guys, but they're really rambunctious. They get you between the fingers, it really hurts. But what I want to say, and I just have to pause for a second, this is Ray Sandwald, a very dear friend of mine. So he taught me everything I know about ants, and the guy's not a scientist at all. He makes false teeth for a living. He's now in his 80s. When I met him, he was just in his early 80s. And he has 3 acres of land on Long Island in which he dedicates to the study of ants. And he knows every single ant on Long Island. And without him, I'm sure I would not have been able to finish my PhD. Anyway, here we're just collecting these ants. And what we discovered was something interesting. I've been collecting these ants for almost 10 years now. And I think there's something that went, in this one particular colony, there was something that went wrong with the regulation of the 95.5 regulation. And what we found is this is what a normal looking soldier looks like here in this species Phytoli morsi. This is what a normal looking soldier looks like. In this particular colony, we found these massive soldiers. And so we called these soldiers super soldiers. Okay? So not only do you have super soldiers now, but you get the appearance, this really weird mutant soldier over here that looks like a super soldier. So in our excitement, we ran to Will Wilson's book to see if there were any species that normally had, because you don't see these very often. I guess they must have just popped out in the colony. And so we ran to Wilson's book and wanted to see, are there any super soldiers that have evolved naturally? And in fact, there are about 6 species that have, and you find them all in the southwest of Arizona. And here's an example. So this is a species, this is the most ancestral species of Phytoli. So this is one of the most ancient ones. And here's what a normal soldier looks like, and that's the massive super soldier of Phytoli rhea. And that's mainly, they again used in defense and cracking seeds. And here's another species, Phytoli obtusospinosa, it's called. Here's a normal looking soldier, and here's that massive super soldier. One of my collaborators spent years trying to figure out what these super soldiers do in southwest of Arizona. And so you see here, this is what the arrow is pointing at over here are army ants. This is a colony of Phytoli obtusospinosa being attacked by army ants. And so what they've used their big heads for is, you can see now that they're blocking the nest. So they actually use their heads to defend against the army ants by blocking the entrance to the entrance of the nest so that the army ants can't get in. And then as soon as the army ants disband because they can't get in, they unblock the entrance of the nest and they swing around to counterattack the army ants from the other side. Okay? So clearly they serve some function, and they're a normal part of the colony. And so here's this Phytoli rhea. Here's the one I showed you, the first one I showed you here, Phytoli rhea. Here's the normal soldier, and here's the natural. They've evolved a natural evolution of a super soldier over here. And so what we did is we reconstructed the history of all this using DNA. We used genes to reconstruct the history here. And you can see here, in another species, sometime it evolved on a separate occasion. You got the separate evolution of this super soldier. And so we thought, well, that's really interesting. This is a very static view of evolution. You've got 2 species that have evolved, not just soldiers, but super soldiers on 2 independent occasions. well, what about other species? Can we get them? Do they have the potential to evolve super soldiers? And so what we did is we messed around with the regulation, that 95.5. Okay, it took a little bit of hormones too. You got to add some hormones to the mix. Okay, and I don't have time to explain it. But what we could do is we could actually go to any part of the phylogeny, any species, while the soldiers are developing. We can just add some hormone to these, mess with the regulation a bit, and we can get super soldiers to just come out. Mutant super soldiers. In this species, we did it. In this species over here, and we did it in another species over there. So although they don't express, it's hidden, they have this hidden potential to produce these super soldiers. Probably inherited from this ancestral species here, which is at the very base of the Phytolite tree. It has super soldiers. They probably kept that potential, and all you needed to do was just mess with their development a little bit, mess with their social regulation, and you can get these super soldiers to pop out in any species that you want. So, what is on the surface is not always what is underneath or the potentials that they have. Species have all kinds of interesting and hidden potentials, and of course, these super soldiers that pop out look quite different than the ones that, I mean, they don't look the same as the other super soldiers. They look quite different. Okay. So this is all fine and dandy, right? And so now we get back to Abouheif as a Muslim, and I'll wrap up now just in a minute. And I'm going to tell you about my son, little Saeed. Okay? This is little Saeed over here. At 3 years old, his birthday was just on September 15th. But unfortunately, you know, just 1 month after he was born, you know, my wife and I, unfortunately, she took him and she went to Jordan. And so I've been ostracized from him for 3 years now. And I think I've seen him a total of just 3 times during his life, and it's been extremely painful. And all I can say, that I can't just bring him back by messing around with regulations and applying hormone and getting little Saeeds to pop out everywhere. I have to find some way to deal with this. And this is the real reality of life. And as an individual, it's nothing in science can really comfort my being separated from him. And so these are the realities and the challenges. We all face challenges in life, just in each a different way. And nothing in science, I can say, can help me with this. No theories, I mean, evolution is a fact. Biological evolution is a fact. Variation, selection, genetic drift is a fact. That's all very nice. And, you know, our connection to the animal kingdom is a fact. But in the end, I don't see my son. So we all have to have a way to deal with that. And so that's what keeps me Abouheif as a Muslim and Abouheif as an evolutionary biologist. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ehab. I'm sure there will be quite a bit of discussion about your particular talk, but I would like to introduce our next panel member to tell us where he's coming from, and then we can have a round of public discussion where you can feel free to ask questions and add comments as you see fit. But first, let's hear from Taner Edis. Taner is a Turkish-American-born person. He's from Istanbul originally. He's a physicist with specialties in theoretical and computational physics. Along with his work in physics, Taner has written and spoken widely on skeptical inquiry into religious and paranormal claims. He completed his undergraduate work at Bogazici, Close enough University, and received his PhD from the Johns Hopkins University in 1994. Dr. Edis is currently Associate Professor of Physics at Truman State University in Kirksville, Missouri. Dr. Edis' first book, The Ghost in the Universe, God in the Light of Modern Science, is an accessible defense of a naturalistic view of the world. It was published by Prometheus Books and received the Morris D. Frokosh Award for Best Humanist Book of 2002. With Matt Young, he co-edited Why Intelligent Design Fails, a scientific critique of the new creationism, published by Rutgers University Press in 2004. In 2006, his Science and Non-Belief published by Greenwood Press appeared, and most recently he wrote An Illusion of Harmony, Science and Religion in Islam, published by Prometheus Books in 2007, which is a unique examination of science, religion, and pseudoscience in a Muslim context. So please welcome Tanner Edis.
Okay, earlier on, actually, there was a question about how we were going to make the session a little bit interesting, in the sense that we've spent 2 days at a conference where Ehab and I have been essentially agreeing on everything, and I'd sort of promised a steel cage death match, and I guess that's sort of my role over here, to be a little bit disagreeable. And so, since we're talking about Islam and evolution, clearly there's something a little bit problematic over here, in the sense that the world's strongest creationist movements are not really in the United States so much, but in places like Turkey, in the Islamic world. And anti-evolutionary beliefs are quite common in Muslim religious intellectual high culture. In fact, sometimes I describe the sort of intellectual high culture that you get in countries like Turkey, and much beyond Turkey as well, as a kind of a generic version of what in the United States we tend to call the intelligent design movement. So there's plenty of religious authorities that reject evolution as biologists understand it. Indeed, very often you find that if a Muslim religious authority says that they do accept evolution, what they have in mind can be something very different than what is current in, say, a biology department. So the question that then pretty much very often occurs is that whether Islam and evolution are compatible, in a sense that we really wouldn't be asking a question like this about, say, evolution and Buddhism. It really doesn't arise in that context. Now, at one level, the answer to this is clearly yes. We can demonstrate that by an example, and here Ehab is your example of somebody who fully reconciles his religious background and his career as an evolutionary biologist. Indeed, Ehab probably has forgotten more about evolutionary biology than I ever knew. I mean, after all, I'm a physicist. From my viewpoint, evolution sometimes is a kind of an interesting exercise in thermodynamics. It's not exactly my life's work. Yet, I think the answer, even though it's yes, has to be a very qualified yes. And to the extent that I think that Ehab might be a little bit uncomfortable with the way I'm going to be qualifying the situation. Well, the first qualification I want to introduce is putting up the question, well, what is Islam in the first place anyway? We tend to think of, when we say, well, what is Islam or what is any religion, we have this tendency to think of, well, authorities, of texts, especially if you have holy books floating around. And we have doctrines, the ideas of, well, the 5 pillars of Islam, or Christian doctrines and Buddhist beliefs and things like this. So there's a tendency to sort of start saying that, well, Islam says this, and, well, evolutionary biologist says this, and ask whether these things are compatible at some deep level or not. Well, I doubt really that this is the best way to approach this whole thing. I think we should really start, especially if we're outsiders to the Islamic tradition, to look at Islam as a human phenomenon rather than something that jumps out of us from texts or doctrines and things like this. The Quran, for example, is clearly not a science text. And when it comes to matters like evolution, it's very open to interpretation. Muslims contest the interpretation of Quranic verses about evolution, about just about anything you can name. And indeed, this is something that's especially true today. The Muslim world right now is in a period of rather rapid religious change. So where people feel less constrained by the religious currents of the past, by the class of religious scholars and their traditional interpretations. And in many places in the world, Muslims are kind of making it up as they go along. It's kind of an exciting period in that sense. But what this comes to is this. The sacred texts in any given religious tradition are very meaningful to believers, But this is precisely because, in another sense, they are quite meaningless. For example, in the Bible, many of us are familiar, being in the United States, of the story of creation in 6 days. Well, there is a mention, an allusive reference rather than a detailed description in the Quran of creation in 6 days as well. Well, very often religious people will try to reconcile this idea of 6 days with what we have learned about deep time with geology and what physical cosmologists today will say that the 14 billion year old history of the universe. Well, 6 days, many people will in fact interpret this as long periods of time and reconcile religious doctrines with their scientific understanding in that way. But if you get to the point where if you're talking about 6 days and that can mean 14 billion years, that is not giving you any information whatsoever about time anymore. It's very different, a religious text, than, say, when in a physics class I might ask a student to calculate the half-life of a certain radioactive substance. And if they get it wrong on the exam, they don't have the option to come to my office and say, well, you can interpret my exam as a different period, which happens to be the right answer. So in that sense, you have to look not at some text, but you have to look at what people actually do. You have to look at Muslim practices. And here, if you look at the distribution of Muslim attitudes about evolution in the Muslim world, Ehab represents a very liberal point of view. Now, this is a liberal point of view that I am very comfortable with, in the sense that I have relatives who are Muslims, I have many friends back in Turkey who are Muslims, and by and large, because of the social strata I happen to come from, they happen to have a very similar liberal attitude towards Islam. However, this is something of a minority point of view in the Islamic world, and in some places this also tends to be an embattled minority. So it's not exactly a representative position. And if you study Islam as a human phenomenon, I think this reveals a lot of barriers to Muslims coming to fully accept evolution as biologists understand it. Now, as I said before, things may change. Islam is not some sort of eternal doctrine that springs forth from texts and things like that. And as I said, Islam is undergoing a period of experimentation and change as we speak. However, you also, at the same time, have to observe that beliefs opposing evolution among Muslims are fairly strong and stable in many ways. Recent developments have often been in the ways of Muslims inventing new forms of creationism rather than progressing in the direction of accepting evolution more fully. So that's one qualification I would add to the situation. Talking about Islam and evolution, are they compatible? In certain ways, it's a wrong question. What kind of Islam are we talking about? And even if we find some kind of Islam like Ehab's variety, where you can reconcile evolution with evolutionary biology, is that really going to be convincing to other people who consider themselves devout Muslims? And coming up with answers that satisfy everybody over here can be very difficult to do. Now let me add a second qualification.
It's 7 o'clock.
It's 7 o'clock. Apparently it's my second qualification. Does this mean I'm running out of time or something like that?
No idea.
Okay.
That's just the debating strategy.
Indeed. The second qualification is perhaps more on an intellectual level than that. The implications of Darwinian evolution have been disturbing religious thinkers, including rather profound and sophisticated religious thinkers in the Abrahamic religious traditions for quite a long time right now. And just because some in these Abrahamic religious traditions have found ways to reconcile evolution with their faith traditions, this doesn't mean that these intellectual ways of disturbing the peace have gone away. Now, certainly it's true, and Ehab pointed this out in his talk, that there is no such thing as a logical inconsistency between, say, believing in a God and accepting evolution, in the sense that there is no strict disproof of God that you're going to get out of evolutionary biology, indeed in anything in science. And most of this is because of the reason that in science we really don't deal with that sort of absolute certainty. But precisely because of that, observing that there is no strict logical inconsistency between evolution and Islam is really not the relevant observation to make. the challenges, the intellectual challenges that come to the Abrahamic traditions through evolution are not at the level of strict logical implication. And indeed, I'd go further. It's not so much that you're going to get some sort of strict, knockdown, ironclad argument about religious issues from science. You're probably not going to get it from anywhere else either. So there's kind of a philosophical, sometimes, motivation to try and find knockdown arguments. But in practice, what this ends up doing is that they give theologians a motivation to reinterpret their traditions. And then we're back to the whole business of Islam not being a set of eternal doctrines, but a rather fluid human enterprise. The problem, though, sometimes with that is that if you're in the position of believing in a religion as kind of a transcendent revelation, being aware of the human nature of the enterprise can be rather difficult to reconcile that with your notion of eternal truths expressed in a religion. So I would like to say that even though we're not talking about strict proof and disproof over here, the complete exclusion of intelligent design notions from the modern understanding of evolution is actually quite significant. Darwinian evolution counts against, and I will emphasize that again, counts against rather than being a strict disproof of cosmic designers, indeed any supernatural agent. And this is a problem that religious thinkers have been feeling very deeply for more than a century right now. Now, evolution, especially from the point of view of a physicist like myself, evolution is analogous to some of the most powerful physical theories that impress me so much that I've decided to spend a lifetime in physics. It's a rigorous explanation, and what's really attractive about it is that it's an explanation that is very counterintuitive. It goes against normal human inclinations to believe in intelligent design as kind of the automatic explanation of functional complexity that we might observe in the world. And Darwinian evolution explains this important phenomenon of functional complexity in a very satisfying way from the point of view of a physicist. And it's impressive precisely because the way Darwinian evolution does its job is to be actually quite reductionistic. In physics, that's reductionistic is not really a bad word, though in the humanities it is. And as reductionistic, it does its job without any kind of mind-like intrusions from the outside. Blind variation and selection and processes like what Ehab described in his transparency of the kind of processes that biologists debate about when they're talking about theories of evolution is exactly what's supposed to be doing the job, and that's precisely what makes it powerful. And now, taking intelligent design out of the picture entirely, what this means is, well, for one thing, it means this. If you're looking at biology and biology alone, you cannot infer a cosmic designer from just looking at biological phenomena. There's no support for an Abrahamic God that's going to be found in evolutionary biology, indeed biology as a whole. Now, to the extent that the idea of God is informed by traditional beliefs about a creator and designer, and most often this is the case, this means that evolutionary biology does in fact undermine it, the belief in God, in the sense that it counts against it. Now again, I have to emphasize, we are not talking about strict proof and disproof over here, because really strict proof and disproof is fairly rare in intellectual life in general, not just in science. And indeed, when I say that if you want to talk about the existence of God, you have to remove evolutionary biology out of the picture, this doesn't mean that evolutionary biology is the only game in town. It might very well be possible to find support for, say, an Abrahamic God from outside of biology. For example, many people like to think that intelligent design is supported not by biology, but by physics. Some of the people, say for example, like Francis Collins, the very well-known now head of the National Institutes of Health, argues to this effect. Ken Miller, who Ehab pointed out as a person who wrote a book defending evolution, and he's a pretty good textbook author and very well-established evolutionary biologist, well, he defends, he makes plausible the existence of some sort of God by, again, relying on an argument which is intelligent design in physics. Well, as a physicist, I happen to be severely unimpressed by the notion of intelligent design in physics as much as in biology. But of course, that doesn't exhaust the picture either, because many people, if they decide to argue that there is publicly available support for their particular supernatural agents, they might argue that, say, their historical experience as a people might support revelation and thus God. Many say, for example, Christian and Jewish believers prefer to argue this way. A longtime favorite has always been to philosophize from the armchair and try and sort of pull up some metaphysical principles that would allow you to make the idea of God at least more plausible, if not just outright proving it. And then there's the favorite among many religious scholars these days, the idea that you can argue from the religious experience of individuals to the existence of some kind of transcendent realm, etc., so on and so forth. What I really want to be saying over here is this. It's not so much that I am impressed by these arguments. I am not. I am very much a religious non-believer. But the point is that it's possible to extend the argument in an area that goes way beyond evolutionary biology. And evolution really is part, and only just a part, of a very wide-ranging intellectual argument about whether supernatural agents are in fact still plausible if you completely take science on board in your understanding of the world. But again, I think evolution is a particularly significant part of the argument. As, say, for example, many religious thinkers in the Islamic tradition, as well as the other Abrahamic religions, have realized, Darwinian evolution locates creativity in nature. It takes it out of the hands of the gods. And this is a problem if your tradition is based on revelation and has for a very long time to take that revelation to say that creativity is not located in nature, in blind, unthinking, mindless nature. That is a problem. Now, this means that you're not going to find creativity in disembodied minds. It means you're not going to find creativity in any sort of supernatural agency necessarily. And an Abrahamic God, which is supposed to be in charge of life and its design, becomes less plausible. And again, I'm not saying this is disproof, but it becomes less plausible when you bring evolutionary biology on board. So, again, that doesn't end the argument. There are certainly liberal religious options in religious traditions, particularly the Abrahamic religious traditions, where you can find some kind of reconciliation between evolutionary biology and God. And in many ways, Ehab does represent this type of religious tradition, which is very much favored by the scientific community in general. But there too, there are certain things about that kind of liberal approach that can be religiously problematic, even though it's scientifically very much acceptable. If you take evolutionary biology on board fully in the realm of life, you tend to get pushed, almost inevitably, in a more deistic direction in your understanding of supernatural agency in the world. Your God ends up being more vague, more remote than the really full-blooded Abrahamic God of the more conservative religious traditions. And this is not very satisfying to many religious people, and they tend to be attracted to more conservative, more outright creationist versions of their tradition. And if it comes to a choice between diluting their stronger understanding of supernatural agency and a modern scientific understanding of the world, their choice is often to stick with the more traditional, more active version of divine agency. So the problem is, the more liberalizing you get, the more diluting your concept of divinity of any cognitive content whatsoever. And this ends up very often being religiously unsatisfying, and perhaps more importantly, it becomes socially unstable. So that's my sort of second qualification on this. I'm not going to take too much more time. I just want to sort of try and suggest what I think it means. What does this all add up to? Well, what this means is that I am actually somewhat pessimistic about the prospects for Islam and Darwinian evolution to live happily ever after. They might learn to ignore each other. If I'm at all optimistic, my hopes are going to be more in that direction. Now, I would certainly like the point of view of people like Ehab to be the one that prevail in the Muslim world. But I think that is fantastically unlikely in our current situation. I am not expecting this to happen in my lifetime, and maybe even longer than that. And indeed, at this point, among Muslims, and especially if you take on board the ideas of more conservative but still intellectually very sophisticated Muslim thinkers, you also have to ask other questions such as, you really need to ask why devout Muslims should feel so pressured to accommodate evolution in the first place. Clearly, at a certain level, devout Muslims do not just care about agreeing with science. They care about other things which might be more important to them, and that may win out, and that may, from their own point of view of looking at the world, quite legitimately drive them more in the direction of a more creationist point of view. So I'll sort of stop over here, and I'll end on that perhaps more pessimistic note.